Hi, everyone. What an honour to be able to speak to you all today. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much, Andy and the team, for inviting me, and especially Andy there for giving me that plug. That was fantastic. I'm going to put you on my website now, with a plug like that. So I'm here to talk about changing behaviour. I think the point I'd like to start with today is that every single one of us in this room is really in the behavioural change industry. We need to persuade other people to change their behaviour, whatever that might be. For each individual, it'll be something different, but we all have a goal of slightly altering the behaviour of people we're trying to communicate with. When we try and make those behaviour changes, we use all sorts of different things. We might go on gut instinct, we might go on data, we might have read a really good book, we might have been inspired by someone else. What we're hopefully going to give you today, though, is more of a framework that you can apply every time you're thinking about trying to change someone's behaviour. A framework you can go back to that's reliable and allows you to change that behaviour. Why listen to me? I should really say you're not really listening to me today. You're listening to academics, researchers who have studied this stuff for over 100 years, and we'll be citing evidence from studies way back in the 60s and 70s to studies done today. But I am Phill Agnew. I've spent my career in marketing, actually. So previous to running the podcast full-time, I was at a bunch of different marketing roles at a number of tech companies. And then 8 years ago, I started a podcast called Nudge, basically because I wanted to speak to a bunch of people smarter than me. A podcast is a great way to be able to interview all the people you love and admire. So I would interview all these experts in the world of behavioural science. And today, like Andy said, Nudge is the UK's #1 marketing podcast and one of the top podcasts around behaviour change and nudge theory. Anyway, enough about me. Why do we need behavioural science? Why, when you're trying to change people's behaviour, should you lean on the world of behavioural science? Well, we can run a quick experiment in this room to show the power of behavioural science. So let's do a show of hands. Number of people in this room who drive. Please raise your hands if you drive. All right, everyone look around, keep those hands raised, look around. It's a lot of the people in this room. Can you lower your hand if you are a below average driver? There's a few of you. Fair play, there is some. So I feel like we should interview those who lowered their hands. Think about this. You can all lower your hands now. Most of you kept your hands raised for obvious reasons. Maybe 10% lowered their hands. Think about it logically, though. Below average means 50% of us should have lowered our hands at that point, right? That's logically how it should work. And yet we see time and time again across multiple different domains that people are overconfident, essentially. We see this with driving. The majority of people obviously think they're above average drivers, apart from the 8 or so of you who I really feel sorry for you, for whoever drives with you in your car. So you get this above overconfidence. You get this in other places as well. Amazingly, if you interview prisoners and you ask them, are you above average or below average in terms of the value you provide to society and the care you give out, they think they're above average, even though they're actually in prison. So we're overconfident in lots of different ways. This is a bias that we have. We can use another one as well. So how many of you, again, show of hands, have either set New Year's resolutions this year or have set them in the past? Please raise your hand if you've set a New Year's resolution. Again, not quite as many of you who have tried. Now keep those hands raised if you have followed that resolution for the whole of the year. None of you. So Chris maybe has got one. But this is the intention to behaviour gap. So it's this idea that we only set New Year's resolutions, of course, because we have the intention to keep them for the whole year. Otherwise, why would we do them? And yet very few of us actually do. So this is the idea behind behavioural science. We have these shortcuts, these heuristics, these biases that we all follow. And if we understand these shortcuts, these heuristics, these biases, as people, like we all are in the behaviour change industry, we can hopefully subtly alter people's behaviour. And this is the idea of applying a bit of behavioural science. So I'll explain a bit of the concept behind how all this works to begin with. So the idea behind this came from a really great researcher, Nobel laureate prize winner, Daniel Kahneman. And he wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, fantastic book, which explained how we make decisions. Him and his co-worker, Amos Tversky, would do a lot of research into how we make decisions. And he discovered that we usually use 2 modes when we are trying to make a decision. This is not literally what happens in the brain. We actually don't really understand what goes on in the brain when we make a decision. But it seems to be how people act when they make a decision. And there are these 2 modes of thinking. There is system one. This is what Daniel Kahneman called it, system one. This is fast, it's unconscious, it's how we make the majority of our decisions. When you're deciding today whether to have tea or coffee, you use the system one. You didn't think about it for 10 minutes and do a SWOT analysis or pros and cons of what you should have. You just picked the one you wanted. If you drove here, you will have used system one to drive. You don't think literally about how much pressure you're putting on the clutch, how you're driving. And yet, at other times, we use system two. This is slow, this is conscious, this is for the few decisions where our brain really needs to engage. So the first time you drove a car, you would have used a system two mode of thinking. You would have thought very carefully about how much pressure you're putting on the clutch. The first time you decided to have a coffee, you would have used system two mode of thinking. You would have thought quite critically about, oh, do I really want to put this bitter taste in my mouth? So we have this system one and system two. The brain is lazy, essentially, and most of the time it wants to use that system one fast unconscious mode of thinking. It takes shortcuts, it uses heuristics to make a decision really quickly without actually having to think of it. And we do this all the time with the majority of the decisions we make. And my idea for you folks today is that if you understand those shortcuts that people make when they're making decisions around their health, when they're making decisions around what to do, if you understand how they're making those decisions, you can better inform those decisions. And this leads us to the whole world of behavioural science, because what we have seen over the past 100 years is psychologists and researchers have deeply studied how we make those decisions. They've uncovered a number of different biases that all of us follow when we are making decisions and have essentially taught us why people make the decisions they do. So let's do a few examples to bring this to light. Social proof. How many of you in the room, just show of hands, anyone who's heard of social proof before? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, so a few of you have, some of you haven't. Social proof is really simple. You've all seen it. It is the idea that we follow the actions of others. So imagine you're on holiday in the south of Spain, you're walking down the seafront and you see two restaurants. One of the restaurant is pretty much empty. There's one couple at a table at the front, they look a bit miserable eating their paella. There's a really aggressive salesman outside, desperate for you to come in. You're thinking, oh, should we go there? The next restaurant is full to the brim, queue out the door, people waiting to get in, no salesman even asking you to come in. Which restaurant do you choose? Obviously, you choose the one that lots of other people have chosen. That is a system one decision. We use a shortcut to make the decision. We follow the actions of others because of a hereditary trait. It's safer. As cavemen, we learned to not go into the cave that a bunch of other cavemen were running out of because there's a tiger or a leopard in there. I'm not an anthropologist, as you can tell. I don't really know what happened. But social proof is this idea that we follow the actions of others. Some wonderful studies that showcase this. One of my favourite is in a UK East London pub. One of my favourite researchers, Richard Shotton, who ran this study, goes into the pub and he asks the barman, what's the best-selling beer? This is around 2015, 2017 in London. At the time, the best-selling beer was London Pride. I don't know what it would be today, probably Neck Oil or Guinness, whatever it is. But at the time, it was London Pride. And he said to the barman, can we tell people, because pubs don't do this, can we tell people that this is the best-selling beer? On alternate weeks, can we put a sign in front of London Pride and simply say, this is the best-selling beer? And the barman agreed. And so on alternate weeks, they would put this sign up, say it's the best-selling beer. They then monitored the sales of London Pride and other beers over that period. They found something rather incredible. You think your decision on what beer you want to buy is totally rational, totally set by your own free will, and yet it doesn't seem to be the case, because when they put a sign up saying this is the best-selling beer, the sales of London Pride increased by 2.5 times. What was interesting was that they measured the sales of all the other beers, they didn't drop. Instead, what seemed to be happening is more people were deciding to try it. So tourists would come and say, oh, we should try that one, that's clearly popular here. Locals who maybe haven't had London Pride in the past thought, oh, that must be good, they've got it on, they're selling lots of it. We come up with rational reasons, but we follow the actions of others. So this is the idea of social proof. There's another one, endowment effect. This is a lovely idea that we feel compelled to finish an action that we have already started. Ernest Hemingway famously said that he never finished a sentence before bed. He always went to bed with a sentence half finished, because he said it was easier for him to wake up the next day and start work on his novel if the sentence was half finished, not finished. None of us, well, not many of us in the book face the same challenge. Not many of us in the room, face the same challenges as Ernest Hemingway. But you can apply this yourself. If you've got a really difficult email to send and you're putting it off, you don't know whether to start, just write the first sentence, because once you've written that first sentence, even if you go to bed afterwards, it gets a lot easier to finish this. And we know this because of a really interesting study by Nunes and Dres. Wonderful study that was done with loyalty cards. They gave out loyalty cards to a bunch of different participants to randomized control trials, so different populations get different groups. And one group gets a loyalty card with 7 stamps you need to collect until you get your free coffee. The other group got a loyalty card which had 9 stamps you needed to collect, except the barista, as they handed over the loyalty card, plugged in the first 2 stamps for free. Buy 2 coffees, plugged in the first 2 stamps. Said, okay, we've got you started on the journey. Now, an economist would look at this and say, they're identical. The individual needs to buy 7 coffees in order to get the next one for free. And yet behavioural scientists would look at this and say, these are two very different things. Because once a task has started, once a task has started to progress, we feel an urge to complete that task. And they found in this study that when you plug the first 2 stamps in, you get an 82% higher completion rate on that loyalty card. So people are far more likely to come back. Let's do one more. Let's do scarcity. Scarcity, many of you will have felt this. If you ever tried to buy Glastonbury tickets or tickets to an event that's selling out fast, you would have felt that scarcity. There's an amazing study about this. This was done in KFC Australia. That's the only probably link with today. The fact that KFC are here is not very useful. Australia is a good link. Anyway, KFC wanted to increase the number of people who are buying their chips for $1 deal. So chips for $1, they offered chips for $1 in KFC Australia. They were promoting this across their marketing channels. They wanted to increase the amount of people who bought it. They pay a lot of marketers a lot of money to come up with slogans. They came up with these amazing slogans. The Colonel has never been so generous. They're loved from Perth to Brisbane. Chips for $1, all these wonderful slogans. They tested them in this huge online trial. Which message would be most effective at persuading people to buy chips for $1? It was simple scarcity. They said, chips for $1, limited to 4 per customer. There's no reason to put that limit in. Not many people were buying more than 4. And yet that message implied that this deal is incredible value, that this is a scarce resource, that I need to buy this now in order to get access to it. And what's hilarious about this is, if you remember back in COVID, all of the supermarkets put limits on how much toilet paper we can buy. You can't buy more than 6. All that did was encourage us to buy 6. We probably wouldn't have bought 6 before. When something becomes scarce, we want it even more. The problem we've got here is I've just talked about 3 different nudges, 3 different behaviour change ideas. There are hundreds of these. And when you're thinking about how do I change behaviour, when you're thinking how do we get more people signed up to volunteer at Parkrun, how do we get more people to join our community club, how do we get more people to donate to the Parks Foundation, whatever it might be, it's really hard to know which one of these to lean on because there's so many. And so today, in this presentation and then also in the next workshop, we're going to walk through a framework, probably the most well-known framework, which helps practitioners, like all of us in the room, actually apply this stuff to our work. It's called the EAST framework. It was developed by the Behavioural Insights team, and they were a team that was set up within the UK government in 2010 to apply behaviour science across the UK government. They're now an independent team that works with governments literally across the world. They work with me. They've authorised me to talk today about the EAST framework, and their framework, I think, is one of the easiest that we can apply when we're thinking about behavioural change. So this is what they say about behaviour change. I'll read this out. If you want to encourage a behaviour, make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, and make it timely. That's where EAST comes from. And I think hopefully after today, every time you're thinking about behaviour change, you'll think about those 4 things. Make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, make it timely. These 4 principles, drawn from behavioural science research and real-world application, offer a practical framework for creating the most effective interventions. So we're going to talk through each of these today. We'll start with make it easy, we'll go on to make it attractive, we'll make it social, and we'll make it timely. I'll give some really interesting examples that hopefully will stick in your mind and allow you to think about ways you can apply this. But hopefully also you'll come up with ways that you can apply this in the organisation that you're working at. You might come up with an idea which might be relevant to one of these, or you might just take the framework back with you. Because what this is not going to change the way you do your work. Instead, it provides you tools to make your work more effective. So that's how you should see this. It's a tool set to make your work more effective. It doesn't change the work you're doing. And we'll start with make it easy. So this is a really simple idea. The simplest way to change a behaviour is to simply make that behaviour easier to do. Best example of this is one of the people who inspires me a lot, Rory Sutherland. I've had him on the podcast a few times. He says, it's kind of hilarious, Clarkson with 3 bins recycles more than Greta Thunberg with 2 bins. So the idea there being, it doesn't really matter how much motivation you feel, how much desire you feel to help the environment. If you make the behaviour easy, if you give Jeremy Clarkson 4 bins, 3 bins, he just will end up recycling more than Greta Thunberg with 2, simply because the behaviour is easy. I'll give a study to back this up. This is a study, really interesting study run in Belgium. It's cited in the East Framework book. It's known as the stocked gun effect, if any of you have heard of that before. And the study is really simple. Belgian supermarkets, they essentially made it easier to buy plant-based food rather than meat-based food, for example. And they did that by putting it next to the meat options in the supermarket. So rather having it in a totally different part of the supermarket, they put it next to the meat options to make it easier for meat eaters to just decide to pick up a plant-based option. And by placing it next to the meat options, they saw that they were able to increase sales of plant-based food by 171%. On different weeks. Now, there's a fear here that that's just meat eaters actually buying the plant-based food thinking it's meat. I think they managed to account for that in some ways by putting signs on and stuff, but that will still be part of the puzzle. But the point remains, if you make the behaviour easy, it's far more likely that people will act. You've all been given a book today by this man, Richard Thaler, absolute legend, wrote the book on nudge theory, literally called Nudge, inspired the name of my podcast. And he says this, he'll say this in the book as well. If you want to make people do a behaviour, make it easy. But how? Let's go through the framework that I'll talk you through when we talk about each of these today. So when we're talking about make it easy, I've got a number of different ways you can try and do that, a number of different examples you can apply, a number of different ideas that you could maybe take to your business. We'll talk about stuff like defaults, reduced cognitive load, simplifying your messages, and consistency. So let's get into it. Defaults. This is a really interesting one. So this, again, is cited in the book that you've all got in your bags today, Richard Thaler. He did a lot of work with Google. Now, Google had this really interesting challenge. If you ever get the chance to go to Google offices, they've got these amazing canteens, free food for all the workers, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the people who were designing this canteen had this interesting idea. They thought, can we subtly change the design of this canteen to change what people eat? So can we just subtly change it? And they ran this experiment with the idea, because they had surveyed people beforehand, they'd surveyed the Google staff, asking, do you want to eat more healthily? And they said yes. So they said, okay, well, let's try and help people eat more healthy without actually changing the choice that's available, and without actually removing the chocolate and the cakes. And so all they did was they changed the defaults. They moved the fizzy drinks from, instead of being behind clear glass, they put them behind opaque glass. They moved the cakes from, instead of being front and center, to right at the back of the room. They put the salads really easy to access. They made the plates slightly smaller. They changed all of the defaults, and lo and behold, people's calorie intake when they were at these canteens was far lower when they changed the defaults. The easiest way to change behavior is to simply change the defaults. An amazing study about this, global study around organ donations. So this chart is quite difficult to look at, but it's essentially saying the number of people in different countries in Europe who are signed up to an organ donation scheme. It's changed a bit in the UK recently, so don't look at that, but Germany and Austria are on there. Germany and Austria are very similar countries. You wouldn't say that the individuals, residents of Germany and Austria, are drastically different individuals who have totally different worldviews. You would say they're pretty similar. And yet, pretty much 100% of people in Austria are signed up to be organ donors, whereas only 12% of people in Germany are signed up to be organ donors. What accounts for this difference? Is it the most incredible marketing advertising campaign of all time that Austria have done to encourage organ donations? No. They simply changed the default. When you sign up to get your driver's license in Austria, they opt you in to being an organ donor and you have to opt out. So say, if you sign up, just so you know, we'll sign you up to be an organ donor. You could sign up, unsubscribe at any time. You can opt out whenever you want. And that one small change, making it the default behaviour rather than an opt-in behaviour, massively increased the number of people who became organ donors, something the UK now applies as well. We can do another example as well. So really interesting one. This is a study at university, and they had this coffee vending machine. And the vending machine, as a default, would give you 3 sugars in your coffee when you ordered a coffee. When it came out, you could subtract the 3 sugars, you could take it away, but that was the default. And they changed it so the default was no sugars, and then they measured how many people put sugar in their coffee, how much sugar they put in. Behaviour changed dramatically. You would think your coffee habit would be entirely based on the amount of sugar you actually want to put in, and yet it actually seems like we're more influenced by the default. There's a similar study that was done with pizza takeaway companies. They found that people order much bigger, complex pizzas when they're doing a choose your own, if the default is to have all of the toppings put on the pizza originally, rather than the create your own being build your pizza from scratch and just having a base level. So the default we set dramatically changes behavior. So think about that today. When you're trying to change behavior, one of the easiest ways to make it easy is to simply change that default. Do another one, cognitive load. Here the idea is, if you're encouraging people, if people have to think too difficultly, think too hard about the behavior you're trying to change, they'll be less likely to make that change. This is a wonderful study by Sheena Iyengar, set up in American supermarkets. And on alternate weeks, she did something really interesting. She would go to the supermarket, she's a researcher, she's a professor, and she would set up this stall where she would sell jam. On some weeks, she would sell 24 different varieties of jam. So she would have gooseberry jam, raspberry jam, chili jam, all these different varieties. On other weeks, she would only sell 6 varieties of jam, just the standard, most common varieties. Now, conventional wisdom says that when you offer more options to people, they will be more likely to take an action. That's what we all believe, right? If you give people 24 different options of jam, they'll be far more likely to pick a jam they want because there's more choice. You'll find the chili jam that you really like, you'll find the raspberry jam that your mum loves and all that stuff. What Sheena Iyengar found was that wasn't the case at all. When she offered fewer varieties of jam, when she made that decision easier, because you didn't have to think so much, far more people were actually likely to make a sale. It actually increased sales by 10 times. It's not a small implementation, it was a massive implementation simply by making the choice easier. So when you're thinking about when you're trying to get someone to change their behavior, think about how hard you're making that choice. Are you showing them 15 different options they can pick from, or are you showing them 3? Because the fewer options they have to pick from, the more likely they are to take an action. One which is probably more relevant to you folks in the room is this really interesting study on encouraging climate action. I believe it was in Todd Rogers, Harvard researcher, his book, Writing for Busy Readers. It's a really interesting study where he gave participants, or the researchers, sorry, I should say, in this study, gave participants who wanted to decrease their carbon emissions, gave them either 20 options, 15 options, 10 options, or 5 options. Now, these are people who want to reduce their climate impact. So some are told, here are 20 different things you can do to reduce your climate. You can recycle, you can go vegan, you can fly less, you can do all these different things. Some are just given 5. And then they measured how many people actually went through and adopted some of those behaviors. Conventional wisdom would make us think the 20 option group would do best. It wasn't the case. Those who received just 5 choices or 10 choices actually ended up taking up some of those choices than those who received too many. Don't overwhelm your audience with too much choice. It'll only discourage them from taking action. There's another really interesting study with donations. This is again from Todd Rogers' book. It's a really interesting study, a fundraising experiment with 700,000 donors. And in the study, I think this is important for everybody who is communicating with the general public and sending them emails, leaflets, whatever else it might be, because it's a really vital lesson. They basically took, Todd Rogers in this study, this fundraising email, took that fundraising email, and it was about 7 paragraphs long. It's quite a long email. They randomly removed paragraphs. So the email now didn't make sense because half of the paragraphs were removed in random order. They simply said, if we just reduce the amount of words, the amount of verbatim, the amount of stuff in this email, more people will take action because it's just a shorter message. It's just more concise. Even if the email doesn't make sense. They remove a lot of these paragraphs, and they found that the shorter email, even though it made less sense, rose 16% more money for charity, 16% higher amount of donations when they reduced the actual amount of information. When you're thinking about talking to people, often if you're trying to encourage behavior change, make it as simple as possible, make it concise. This is such a great example. Barack Obama, 2008, ran lots of different email studies to try and get people to donate. The most effective email he sent was this one. It just said, hey, I need you with me on this one. Tonight's deadline is the biggest left yet. Please donate. That was the most effective email. You wouldn't think it. You would think Obama's most effective email at raising money would be deeply analytical, lots of data, lots of reasons as to why they should take action. It's not the case. Simpler is often better. So reduce the cognitive load. Consistency. Really interesting finding, this one. So again, this is from Robert Cialdini's work. He essentially, in his book, Influence, went to people's households and was obsessed with this idea of consistency. He wondered, if we get someone to take a small action, will they then be likely to take an even bigger action? So what he did is he went to one group of people, this was in America, said to them, can you erect these, and apologies for the awful AI image here, can you erect this massive drive safe sign in your front lawn to encourage drivers around the neighborhood to drive safe? Nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to put a massive sign in their front lawn telling people to drive safe. You spend a lot of time mowing that lawn. You don't want to put up a massive sign for the council saying to drive safe. He went to another group of people and he asked them for a much, much smaller commitment. He said, I've got these little stickers, drive safe stickers. Do you mind just putting a little sticker on your door? So when people come to the door, they just know that you're part of the drive safe community. Most of them agree. Really small commitment to make, not a big deal. They say, oh, I can put that sticker up there. 3 weeks later, Robert Cialdini goes back to the households where he has asked them to put the sticker up, asks these people, will you put up the massive drive safe sign? And the amount of people who agreed was far, far higher, 3 times increased the amount of people who actually agreed to put up the drive safe sign because they had committed to a small action first. The idea is people like to stay consistent with the behaviours they've already taken. So if you get someone to commit to something small, they'll be far more likely to commit to something big. Loads of ways we've seen this. Uri Ganesi, in his brilliant book, Mixed Signals, he did a whole book around incentives to get people to take certain actions. And he found that offering university students incentives to attend the gym basically found that if you pay people to attend the gym and they start attending, they're far more likely to keep going to the gym just because they'd built that consistency, that habit. We're far more likely to do something when we've already started. My favourite example of this, though, comes from Katie Milkman's work, and it's around encouraging people to volunteer. It's such a good one. And there's so many things I'm talking about today where you have to think quite creatively to apply it. I think many of you could probably apply this exactly as Katie Milkman has applied this in the study. So she was trying to get people to volunteer for a local university event. It was an event that was run sort of across the whole year, so they had to volunteer for sort of a year-long commitment. She basically would ask people, talk to them about the event, talk to them about what they had to do, but she would change one thing in the way she asked people. Half the time she would say to people, the commitment is small. You just have to volunteer for 4 hours a week. I mean, it's actually quite a big commitment, let's face it, massive commitment. But she framed it in the smallest way possible. Maybe she could have framed it in an even smaller way and said it's only 20 minutes a day, but she said 4 hours a week. To another group of people, she said, yeah, it's a yearly volunteer work. It's 208 hours a year. So she framed it in the big sense. She said this is quite a big commitment, 208 hours a year. What she found was people were 8% more likely to volunteer if they were given the small commitment as the offer first rather than the big one. So if you're trying to get people to volunteer, if you're trying to get people to take up an action, think about the smallest possible thing they have to do to get started. Use that as your hook, because that'll make them more likely to engage. Other examples were polling stations, webinar commitments. If you ask people to commit to coming to a webinar in advance, they'll be more likely to do it. If you, studies at dentists, if you get people to write down, and you'll be doing this today with your pledge letters, you will be manipulated today as well, guys, I'm sorry to say it. But if you get people at the dentist, this is a study in Steve Martin's book, to write down the time and date they will come back to the dentist for the next appointment, they are far more likely to come back than if they don't do that. If you get people to make a small commitment, a small pledge, they'll be far more likely to actually follow through with it. So that's make it easy. That was make it easy. This idea that if you make the behavior as easy as possible, people will be far more likely to follow it. Now we can do the next side of it. Let's do it to make it attractive. Let's change the decision people are making to make it as attractive as possible, starting with distinctiveness. Distinctiveness is really interesting. The idea here being if an option is distinct, if it stands out in our mind, we'll be more likely to remember it, more likely to follow through with it. Wonderful study. This is from the world of marketing, so I apologise, this is a bit of an advertising example, but it's with Heineken. Heineken, back in the 1990s, tested loads of different slogans to promote their beer. And what was really interesting about their study is so many of the slogans, you can't really read them on there, so I'll read them out to you. They're kind of familiar. Heineken's got a great taste. Heineken, open your world. Heineken, the beer we all love. This is sort of the slogans we always see beer brands doing. And yet in there, they included one totally distinct slogan that would have made sense to the Americans they were selling to. It said, Heineken, the beer that made Milwaukee jealous. It stood out. Milwaukee was a big brewer, a number of competitors, stood out in people's minds, it was distinct. And when they then asked people, after a few days, how many of those slogans do you remember? They find that the distinct slogan is consistently far more memorable, far more likely to be recalled than a slogan that is bland. There's an image I love which showcases this more than anything else. It is an image for a heavy metal concert. Which band do you think would stand out in your mind? It's obviously going to be Party Cannon, the one on the right here. So Party Cannon, if you look at heavy metal band logos, they all look identical, right? Party Cannon have decided to brand themselves as if they're a kid's soft play, essentially. They've sort of taken their inspiration from Toys R Us. They are distinct compared to their comparison set, and they're far more popular than they otherwise probably would be because they're distinct compared to everything else around them. Now, how can you apply this? Well, there's a number of different studies which sort of showcase this. So Steve Martin did some work with the Australian tax residency. He found that most people weren't paying their tax. Most people who were receiving letters saying, you've got to pay your tax, they weren't paying their tax immediately afterwards. They had tried changing the incentives, changing the fines, changing all these things around the tax. Steve Martin says, well, let's look at the letters you're actually sending. The letters they were sending to people, the letters that were coming through the letterbox were simple white envelope letters, looked like all of the other letters you're receiving. He said, let's make the letter more distinct because that might actually encourage people to open it. So what they did is they put a big red stamp on all of the letters on the outside of the letter, which simply said, this is urgent. Obviously, when you receive a letter and it says urgent on the outside, you're more likely to open it. People were more likely to open the letter. And ultimately, they saved Australians $4 million in tax penalties because they were more likely to pay their tax on time because the message they created was distinct. There are so many ways you can make your message distinct. Again, another way, we've done it today. In your bags, you will find handwritten letters, handwritten notes, thanking you for being here. And this is a really powerful way to communicate with people because it's so distinct from what we typically see. We're so used to seeing printed messages that writing something by hand really stands out. Amazing study in South Korea. It's an e-commerce study. 3 different variants of this study. So South Korea e-commerce company, they had a number of people buying their products. And then for some of them, they wouldn't send anything. They would just send the product, no thank you note. For another group, they would send a thank you note with a thank you message typed up and printed. For a third group, they would send a handwritten note. It appeared to be handwritten. It was actually printed, but it looked like a handwritten note. Well, at least it was handwritten originally, and then they then scanned it and repeated it. Sent these 3 different versions to all of their customers, and then they measured the responses. They found that the control group, that was this baseline. The one who received the typed up thank you note, they increased they spent $29 more than the control group. The ones who received a handwritten note spent $50 more than those who received no note at all. So distinctive messages really stand out in our mind. Another way you can make your message really attractive is loss aversion. This is the idea that losses feel twice as painful as equivalent gains. So if you're walking back to your car today and you find a £20 note on the floor, you feel pretty good. Feels great to see a £20 note. However, if your boss messages you midway through this talk and says, I'm really sorry, I've got to take away £20 from your next paycheck because we're using that money for something else, you'll feel really bad. In fact, what Daniel Kahneman has found is that you'll feel twice as worse about losing £20 than you will feel about gaining £20. We feel losses as twice as painful as the equivalent gain we would feel as if we gained it. There's all these interesting ways that we as communicators can apply this to change people's behaviour. This amazing Elliot Aronson study. What he wanted to do in this study was persuade people to put insulation in their homes. Half of the time, he would tell people what they can gain by putting insulation in their homes. You can save 75 cents a day in your energy bill if you put insulation in your home. The other half of the people received a message talking about what they might lose. They said, you are losing 75 cents a day in your energy bill by not having insulation. When they framed the message in terms of a loss, it increased the sign-up rates by 61%. So think about that when you're talking to people. Think about that when you're trying to persuade people. Don't just talk about what they might gain from taking up your idea. Talk about what they might lose if they don't. Really similar study with pension benefits. In Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, found that if you say you might lose out on these pension benefits rather than saying you can gain these pension benefits, increase the amount of people signing up by 27%. That's loss aversion. Let's go on to a really, really interesting one. It's the IKEA effect. Wonderful idea. This was taught to me on my podcast by Mike Norton, the guy who actually researched the IKEA effect. And this blew my mind because I hate IKEA, right? So I get flat pack furniture and I literally can't do it. I don't have the right screws. I end up using a butter knife to screw something in. My partner gets angry at me. We all fall out. It's horrible. And yet Mike Norton, what he did in his study was he gave people IKEA products. Some people received expert-built IKEA products, built by the actual experts in the store. So they would get a wardrobe that's been expert-built. Other people were given the flat pack furniture and said, build it yourself. After they had built it, at the end of the experiment, he said, okay, we want to buy these wardrobes. You've got these wardrobes now. We want to buy them off you. How much do I need to pay you? How much would you ask for me to buy this off you? Now, you would think that the expert-built one, those people would value it more, right? It's expert-built after all. It's not built by you and probably has a few scratch marks and all that stuff. But what he found was that people were asked, framed it slightly differently there, but people were asked for 63% more when they had built it themselves. So the idea here is people value products, services, organizations more if they feel they have had a part in creating that product, service, organization, or idea. I can do some examples to showcase this. This is a really interesting one from Stuart Sutherland's book, Irrationality. He gives people lottery numbers, lottery cards. What am I talking about? Lottery tickets. Some people receive the lottery tickets with the numbers already filled in. Other people get to pick their numbers, how we do in the UK. You get to pick your numbers before the lottery. Again, similar to the IKEA study, he asks people, how much will you be willing, before the lottery is called, for me to, how much will you ask if I was to buy those tickets back off you? Those who had the numbers filled in for them asked for about $1.90. Those who were able to fill in the numbers themselves asked for about $8.90. It's incredible. We value things far more when we've had a role in creating it. I think one of the reasons the National Lottery is so successful is not because of the great rewards you can get, it's because people like picking their own numbers, feel real value over doing so. Let people feel an ownership of it. A really, really easy way to do this is this study. I love it. It's from Robert Cialdini's book, Influence. He creates this fake restaurant for the study. It's called, what is it called? Splash? Anyway, that's not relevant. He then asks people basically for their input on this restaurant before it launches. Tries to get people involved with it, something that you probably do. Before you launch a big community event, you try and get people involved in the creation of that event. But he asks in one of three ways. Some people are asked for feedback. Some people are asked for, opinions? Some people are asked for opinions. Some people are asked for their expectations, while another group are asked for their advice. So one is quite proactive, they're giving their advice. One is quite reactive. When people are asked for their advice, something changes in their mind. If I'm asked for advice about a restaurant that's opening, I'll give my advice. And then when that restaurant opens, I'll feel some connection to it. I'll feel like I've had a role in the creation of that restaurant. And he then measured the amount of people who went to actually sign up to go to this restaurant. Those who were asked their advice were far more likely to actually sign up to go to the restaurant than those who were asked for their expectations or opinions. So get people involved. Let's do one more. This is the curiosity gap. Really, really wonderful one. Anyone here with octopus energy? Maybe a couple? Well, for those of you who aren't, they do the most amazing behavioural science intervention I have ever seen. And it is when you go to give your gas an electric reading. It's like the most painful thing in the world, isn't it? It's like, oh, I have to go check the reader. That's what I used to be like when I was on British Gas. Now I'm on Octopus Energy. I cannot wait to give my gas reading. Because they do this. They do this thing on the right. Oh, it's so much fun. Every time you give a gas reading, you get to spin a wheel. And I'm not kidding. You have the chance of winning basically free electricity for life every time you spin this wheel. It's so exciting. I've been doing this for 4 years. I've not won anything. And yet I still feel this excitement. This is behavioural science bias, which is basically this idea that if something sparks our curiosity, if it gets us excited, we're far more likely to actually take that action. And my favourite example of this is a cafe in Thailand that I went to, and I love this. So it had a 5-star rating, this cafe, loads of reviews. It's the reason we went there. And then when we were eating our meal, we were like, this is quite nice, maybe not 5 stars. We're sort of wondering why they had so many good reviews, and I saw this on the table. Do you want to receive a surprise? Oh, yeah, obviously. Open your camera, scan the QR code. That then takes you to TripAdvisor or Google, then asks you to leave a review. Well, I'm about to receive a surprise, so obviously I'm going to give a 5-star review. I won't even think twice about it. And then you go to the counter and you show the review, and they give you a surprise. Now, the surprise was very disappointing. It was a energy date ball. I don't mind these things, these little dates balls, they sort of roll them up. They're all right, they're fine. But when I hear surprise, I'm thinking cake or pastry, basically one of those two things. Got my surprise, went down, sat back, and I was like, I have been totally nudged here. If they had written on there, do you want to receive an energy date ball? I would have never left a 5-star review. But because they made me curious, because they asked the question, I was far more likely to engage. So think about this. There's some studies which showcase this. Lots of examples about how if you spark curiosity in people, they'll be more likely to engage. Think about this when you guys are setting up your events. If you want to raise engagement for your next event, make something exciting about it. Say, we'll give a surprise to everyone who attends. Say, if you sign up now, you'll get an interesting bit of advice from a guest speaker, whatever else it might be. Curiosity Gap can make your message more attractive. How are we doing for time? 10 minutes, 20 minutes left. Let's get on to make it social. So we've done make it easy. We've done make it attractive. Now we're on make it social. We spoke about social proof at the start. This idea that we follow the actions of others. There are other ways we can make it social, other ways we can use social elements to make the behaviour we're trying to encourage more persuasive. I'm going to show a picture which showcases social proof perfectly. This is from a cake store. Now, what you'll see is that basically none of the cakes have been eaten. One of the cakes is almost finished, and there happens to be a sign by that cake saying it's a top seller. Now, previously, before I knew about the world of behavioural science, I would have said, oh yeah, well, lots of people have bought that cake, so it's a top seller. Now I know the only reason that cake is almost sold out is because of the top seller sign. It's the same reason with the beer example that I gave at the start. So we are influenced when we see that other people take certain behaviours. There's another really interesting study. This is from the Behavioural Insights team who invented the EAST framework. They worked with the UK government to try and persuade people who are filling in their self-assessments to pay their tax on time. And they did all sorts of different things to try and persuade people, all sorts of incentives, all sorts of fines, send these letters. And they found that the most effective way to get people to actually pay their tax on time was to add a simple line, this is essentially cost-free, a simple line to their letter, which simply read, the great majority of people in your local area pay their tax on time. Most people with a debt like yours have paid it by now. Simple. You just say what other people are doing. What's interesting, it gets even more effective the more personal you get it. You guys are working in small community events and areas. You can be more persuasive because you can talk about people not just in Doncaster, but in a specific area. We can get into some examples of how this works. Start with a more general one, which is this whole idea of social proof. This was cited in Nancy Harthurt's brilliant 2022 book. And she does this wonderful thing, this wonderful study with restaurants where they have specials. And sometimes they frame the specials by saying, we'd suggest these in this order. And sometimes they would simply say, these are our most popular specials. Both were true in both scenarios, but sometimes they talk about how other people purchase it, whereas other times they just talk about what they would suggest. By framing it as in terms of most popular, increased demand for those items by 13 to 20%. This is the study I think you should really take away though, because this really talks about the power of personalising your social proof. So all of us will have been to a hotel and we will have seen a card on the bed which says, please reuse your towels because of the environment, essentially. And we all think, you're liars, you just want to reduce your water bill and your energy bill. You don't care about the environment at all. Or at least I do, because I'm a cynical person. Anyway, Robert Cialdini, this researcher that I've been citing quite a bit, he ran some really interesting studies to try and get people to reuse their towels. He used the environmental plea as the control. That was the control. Okay, put the environmental plea on people's beds, say, reuse your towels for the environment. And about 33% of people do when they see that message. Then he did some social proof variants. Then he created a message which essentially said, most people in this hotel are reusing their towel. When he put that message on the bed, it increased the amount of people who reused their towel by 44%. Now, you could say there's some ethical dilemmas there because most people actually weren't reusing their towel. But you could say something different. More people than ever before have started reusing their towel in this hotel would be another way to frame that message, which would be ethical. But he then did something really interesting, and this is something that most of us wouldn't think about. He then slightly tweaked the message to say, most people in this hotel room are reusing their towel. Now, you would look at this and think, why would that persuade anyone? I don't really care what other people have been doing in this room before. In fact, I'd rather not think about it. Why would that persuade anyone at all? And yet, when he said most people in this room have reused their towel, that increased towel reusage up to 48%. And he discovered that social proof becomes more effective the more personal it gets. If you say, for example, studies run in London, if you say we've got the fastest internet provider in the UK, that's actually less effective than a billboard in Charing Cross Station which says we have the fastest internet provider in Charing Cross Station. It feels more persuasive if it's more local. It feels more real. We can trust it more. And because it's people like us, we're more likely to believe it. So when you're trying to get people to change behavior and you're trying to think about social proof, make it as personal as possible. You can also use this. It's the halo effect. Very interesting idea. It's the idea that if we are close to high status others, we'll be seen as more positive ourselves. Essentially, if I had managed to convince Brad Pitt to just stand about 2 meters away from me while I was giving this presentation and not say anything, just stand there and look nice, you would think far better of me just because I was close to Brad Pitt. I would have this spillover halo effect. There's this really interesting study which found that if stores that open up next to high status stores, so if you open up next to a Rolex store, you'll get far more people wanting to spend far more money just because you're next to a Rolex store, irrelevant of what you include in that store. I'm not sure it would work for Poundland, but for most stores it probably would work. I tested this myself. This is a study I ran with general population study on Google Survey. Half of the people I showed an image of my podcast logo, and I asked them, would you listen to this show? None of them had listened to the show before. The other half of the people I showed basically the same image, except in the background of the image were images of other podcasts that were far more popular than mine. Desert Island Discs, Diary of CEO, stuff like that. And so that I was getting associated with these high status others. Sent this to 1,000 participants in the UK. Those who saw just the logo, 6.4% would listen. Those who saw my logo, but with Desert Island Discs in the background, were far more likely, 3 times more likely to actually listen. How can you guys apply this? Well, think about the types of organizations you can associate yourself with. This is a really interesting study that might be relevant to some of you in the room. They found that across 7 experiments, products that were developed with a university and talked about the fact that they were developed with a university. So this product was developed in collaboration with the University of East Anglia, for example. People were willing to pay 65% more, 16% more likely to click on ads, and 2.4 times more likely to actually recommend these products. This is why you will almost always see when a startup promotes itself, they'll always say we have an engineer from NASA, essentially. The engineer's probably rubbish, probably didn't do anything at all, but it's that association with a high value others. One thing to watch out for, you have the halo effect, which is the positive association. You also have the horn effect. This is the idea that if you have something negative about your brand or you associate yourself with something negative, that will spill over and affect other things. Best example of this is typos. So this is a real image for freshly brewed coffee. You can imagine many more of these examples, but Stanley and Schotten ran a study that found that if a greengrocer's sign has a typo in it, people assume that the actual greengrocer's product is 17% worse because they associate that typo with the type of product. So be careful with that as well. We'll finish with herd mentality. This is basically a spillover effect of social proof. The idea, again, that we look for others to inform our behavior. There's a wonderful example of this from the Tokyo Olympics. So you see the 2 Italian winners, they're both sort of biting the medal because that's what a lot of people do. The Chinese winner looks at them, thinks, oh, okay, I guess I should bite the medal. It does the same thing. We look to others to inform our behavior. And there's studies that showcase this really interesting study, which was encouraging people to use these sort of dispenser sun cream dispensers. I think this was across Belgium. I'm not sure how sunny Belgium gets, but apparently there are days when you need these dispenser sun cream. And on sometimes they would add to that dispenser how many times it had been used in that day. So to have a little message saying this has been used 1,400 times today, or it's been used 10 times today, it's been used 50 times a day. A bit like sometimes when you're cycling around, different cities have this, they'll tell you how many people have cycled on that route over the course of the year. When they put that message up, when they said 1,000 other people have done this today, or this month, or this year, it increased the amount of people who actually used a dispenser by 32%. So increased it by a dramatic amount. So show people what other people are doing. We've done make it easy. We've done make it attractive. We've done make it social. We'll finish with make it timely. And I have to be timely about it because I don't have much more time left. So there's some examples of different ways we can apply this here. Let's shoot through them. Scarcity. I spoke about scarcity at the start. It's the idea that we were drawn to items that are more scarce. Wonderful example of this comes from Concorde. The day Concorde announced that they would stop flying between London and New York, in 3 years' time, what they found was as soon as they announced that, all of the remaining tickets on sale suddenly were sold out within 24 hours. Nothing had changed about the product, the service, the price. The only thing that had changed was that an abundant resource suddenly became scarce. There are different ways you can apply this. One is a wonderful Richard Shotton study. He was asking people how likely would you be to go and see some of the popular movies that were out at that moment. And he asked them, and most people said, oh yeah, I might go, I'm not sure, I might go. Then to some of them, he said, by the way, this movie is ending this weekend. That was true. All of the movies were stopping airing that weekend. When he said when the movie would stop airing, it increased the chances that people would actually go and watch the movie by 36%. We spend so much time when we're creating ideas and events thinking about when it's going to be released. We often don't say when it might stop becoming available. If you've got a project, if you've got an organization, don't just talk about when you're releasing it, talk about how long they'll be able to have access to it, because they might be more persuaded when they find out that it's ending. A couple of examples that I love, I've found of these. In a London pub on Sloane Street, there's this pub. Every pub talks in the same way. They usually say great beer, great people, great prices. This pub comes up with such an interesting slogan. It just says, we're the only pub on Sloane Street. Very simple, very true. And they get people queuing out the door simply, I think, partly because of that message. You think, well, if it's the only pub, I should probably go in here. This is a picture of Wordle. Do you remember Wordle, the Wordle craze? Anyone still doing Wordle, actually? I'm not sure if it's something many people still do. Anyway, it was a real craze at the start. And one of the reasons it was so successful was because it was scarce. You only got to do one Wordle a day. If you were able to do 100, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as persuasive. The scarcity influences us. And there's lots of studies that prove this, but I think we've covered enough to know that. One other thing to think about when we're thinking about timeliness is what happens at the end of the experience. So scarcity might encourage people to come along, but when they actually experience that experience, how can we make that ending as positive as possible? It's this really interesting concept called the peak end rule. This is the idea that when we're reviewing an experience, say your latest holiday, when you're thinking about your latest holiday, you probably remember two things: the last thing you did on your holiday and the best experience of the holiday, the peak and the end. And some amazing studies by Daniel Kahneman have found that if you slightly change the ending of an experience, people interpret that experience totally differently. So he got students to put their hands in icy cold water. It's a horrible experience. Nobody likes it. It's not going to cause lasting damage, but it's really painful and not very nice. The water was set to 13 degrees. It's just not nice to do. It's a bit like getting in an ice bath or something. One half of the students keep their hands in the icy cold water for 60 seconds at 13 degrees. Another group of students also put their hands in the icy cold water at 13 degrees for 60 seconds. And then, for the extra 30 seconds at the end, they increased the temperature slightly to 14 degrees or 15 degrees. It's still unpleasant, still not nice keeping your hand in that water, but they made it slightly more comfortable. He then asks both groups, how was that experience? Would you be likely to do it again? Those people who have had their hands in the water for 30 seconds longer were more likely to do the experience again, simply because the ending was slightly nicer than those who had it for less time, 60 seconds, but had the harsh ending. The end of the experience is really important. Don't just think about the start, think about the end, because the end can be the thing that people remember. When we're thinking about making it timely, we should also think about mere exposure. This is the idea that the more we are exposed to an idea, to a concept, to a word, to an organisation, the more we will like that thing. This is Robert Zionik's amazing studies. He was working in Michigan University, and he basically, back in the 80s, put these ads in the university newspaper that was widely read, and the ads would simply have a Chinese Mandarin character. Nobody knew what the character meant. Most people didn't speak Chinese. Most people didn't speak Mandarin. Just put this Chinese character in the ad. It was on there for about 6 weeks. And then after, he would get people into his study and ask people to review different Chinese characters. They didn't recognize, they couldn't recall that they'd seen one before, but the one they'd seen time and time again in the newspaper, they liked far more. The more you expose someone to your idea, to your concept, the more people will like it. We also find this with trust. The more you repeat an idea, the more people will believe and trust that idea. We'll finish on anchoring, because it's one of the best ways to, I think, finish a talk, because it's such a wonderful example. And this is the idea that people are anchored by not just, we spoke at the end about the last thing they see, but when they're reviewing a concept, they think a lot about the initial piece of information they're shown. There's a great example of this from Steve Jobs' 2010 Keynote for the iPad. Now, when the iPad was launched, I don't know how many of you remember this, lots of people thought, why on earth do we need an iPad? We've got laptops, we've got phones, why do we need an iPad in between? Steve Jobs was well aware of this, and in fact, he was well aware of it because he was pitching at the time to all of the journalists who had said, I don't think this product is necessary, we don't need an iPad. And they were debating, how much should this thing cost? Some said it shouldn't cost more than $200. Most said it should cost around the $400 mark. One person predicted, it might cost $999 because it's got some really smart tech in there. And so Steve Jobs, he's introducing the iPad to the journalists in the room, and then he gets to the pricing part. This is the part they're all waiting for. How much is this actually going to cost? We don't even know if we need this product. And so on stage, he does this. He gets that one person who said $999, said, some of you in this room think the iPad will cost $999. That's true, one person did. And then he says, we're so proud. We're so proud because we've worked tirelessly day and night to get that to a more reasonable price for you. And I'm so happy today to announce that it will be $499, not $999. And the journalists in the room who had previously been sort of saying this shouldn't cost more than $400 are suddenly whooping and cheering because he had set the anchor differently. So we are anchored by the initial piece of information we see. You will have all seen this whenever you go to a restaurant and you look at the wine list. If you look at the wine list and the first wine on the list is £50, you think, oh God, that's a lot. You scroll down, you find one for £30, you suddenly think £30 is probably reasonable value. If you go to a restaurant and the first wine on the list is £15, and then you scroll down, you see one for £30, you suddenly think £30 is way overpriced. We're anchored by the initial piece of information we see. Amazing 2006 study. This was with Americans who had never tried a mango lassi before. Some of them were told this is a healthy lassi. So this is try this healthy mango lassi. Others were told, try this unhealthy mango lassi. And simply by having that perception in their mind, I'm not sure it would work in the UK, but it worked in America, this connection with unhealthiness and taste, they found that those who were told this is an unhealthy lassi ranked the exact same drink as 55% higher for taste than those who are simply told it's healthy. We're anchored by the initial piece of information we see. Amazing study in San Francisco around donations for a charity. Sometimes they went up to people and just said, would you mind donating for this charity? The residents they were asking were clearly very wealthy because the average donation was $60. If they said beforehand, just to let you know, someone right before you donated $400, set this ridiculous anchor, said, someone before you donated a huge amount. It increased the average donation not to $67, it increased it to $143. It massively influenced how much people donated. So we're massively influenced by the anchor, massively influenced by what people, initial piece of information people are told. I'm going to skip through this last one because I think we're getting to time and I've covered an awful lot, and I'm so grateful for you all paying attention to all of that because we've covered an awful lot there. But to take a step back, we've gone super detailed and I've tried to give you lots of different ideas that you can apply, lots of different ways in which behavioural science can be used to alter people's opinions. But really the takeaway that you should all have when you're thinking about behaviour change is this. When you're trying to change someone's behaviour, think, how can I make that behaviour easy to do? How can I make that behaviour slightly more attractive? How can I make it more timely? Whether that's making it seem scarce or whether that is making the end of the experience seem more relevant. And how can I make it more social as well? How can I suggest not only that lots of other people are doing this thing, but lots of other people like you are doing that thing? If you follow that EAST framework, hopefully, because we're all in the behaviour change industry, I think, hopefully changing behaviour should be slightly more easy. Thank you very much.